Okay, this lesson's entitled Geography of the Fertile Crescent. And right now we are in Chapter 5, Mesopotamia. And we're going to be talking about the geography of the area. So let's look at the Read to Learn activity. It says, in what ways did two great rivers affect life in this region? Our vocabulary is plateau and drought. Our places are the Fertile Crescent, Tigris River, Euphrates River, and Mesopotamia. So let's talk about the read aloud. It says, for 6 days and 7 nights the wind blew. Flood and tempest storm overwhelmed the land, and when the 7th day arrived, the tempest and flood blew themselves out. The sea became calm, the wind grew quiet, the flood held back. Silence reigned, for all mankind had returned to clay. These words came from an ancient Western Asian story about a flood that destroyed most of humanity. Ancient stories like this one later influenced people all around the world. The big picture. Around 4000 BC, Egyptian farm communities were growing along the Nile River in Africa. Another civilization was developing in a vast region to the northeast. This region in Western Asia was later called the Fertile Crescent. A crescent shape looks like a quartered moon. Find the Fertile Crescent on the map on the next page. It covers present-day countries of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. So it asks us to go to the map here, and here's our crescent shape, okay? Our countries are not outlined because this is a physical map, if you notice from the title. But the present-day countries, again, are Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Much of this land was either rocky mountains or deserts. Parts of the Fertile Crescent, however, were lush and green. Two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, made life in these areas possible. Like the Nile in Egypt, these rivers affected the people living along the banks. As you can see from the story above, the river's effects were not always positive. So that's interesting. I want to see maybe what some of the negative effects were and how people dealt with them. So I'm thinking about that as I'm going to read my lesson. Between two rivers. The region between the Tigris and the Euphrates is known as Mesopotamia. So again, if you look at our map, here's the Tigris and here's the Euphrates, and the land between is called Mesopotamia. In Greek, Mesopotamia means land between two rivers. This area is now known as Iraq. Mesopotamia included several types of physical regions. Follow the course of the two rivers on the map. Let's see how Mesopotamia's northern and southern regions differ. So if you look at it, we're emptying into the Persian Gulf here. Up here we have the Taurus Mountains, and we're emptying here into the Mediterranean Sea. To the right we have the Zagros Mountains. From mountains to sea. Both the Tigris and Euphrates rivers begin in the snow-capped Taurus Mountains of what is today Turkey. So again, it starts here. Both rivers start in the Taurus Mountains. It's present-day Turkey. The rivers rush down the narrow canyons to the valley below. Then the Tigris and Euphrates reach the plateau of present-day northern Iraq. A plateau is an area of elevated flatland. In southern Iraq, the rivers continue to flow to the lower land. Here they make their way to the Persian Gulf. So we talked about the Persian Gulf, which is right over here. Flood. As in Egypt, early communities in Mesopotamia depended on river deposits of silt. Silt made the region a good place for farming. Early farmers had to meet several challenges, though. Mesopotamia's yearly floods did not come as regularly as those in Egypt. In fact, they often came just as the wrong time for farmers. The Tigris and the Euphrates did not flood during planting season when dry fields needed to be softened and prepared for new growth. Instead, the floods often burst through fields just as crops were about to be harvested. Such deadly floods cost not only crops but lives and homes as well. So that's interesting. The floods came at the wrong time, and they were not predictable. Farmers had to protect their fields from flood damage. They also had to keep their crops watered in the hot, dry climate. Southern Mesopotamia rarely received more than a few sprinkles of rain each year. Droughts or long periods of dry weather were a constant threat to farmers and their crops in southern Mesopotamia. Northern Mesopotamia, in contrast, usually had enough rain to make some farming possible. Yet the rocky earth of the northern plateau had only pockets of fertile soil. The flooding rivers did not leave behind as much silt here in the north as to the south. For this reason, southern Mesopotamia became better known for its fertile fields than northern Mesopotamia. So more fertile fields here than here. From river to field. In the fall, farmers in southern Mesopotamia needed water to plant and raise new crops. Unfortunately, fall was the time when the Tigris and Euphrates were at their lowest. Spring was harvest time in ancient Mesopotamia. However, it was also the time when the rivers flooded their banks. Then farmers often got more water than they wanted. To solve these difficult ancient solve these difficulties, ancient farmers learned to build water control and irrigation systems. So, their problem or their solution now, the problem was the water came at the wrong time. Here is their solution. They built water control irrigation systems. Look at the diagram above to see how these systems work. So, that's interesting. So it says, like the ancient Egyptians, Mesopotamians also adapted to the farming. So here we have the canal, the river. Here we have the canal. And the canal then is bringing it, and there's a gate here so they could stop the water when there was none, or they could let the water out, and they built artificial lakes where they would put this water as a containment system. Today we have water containment systems, and we have reservoirs. We also have water towers. So that's interesting. They were learning how to have a water containment system. Farming in ancient Mesopotamia. Early Mesopotamian farmers grew many different crops. If you were able to go back in time there, you would see the fields of wheat and barley. These were the region's most important crops. You would also see gardens of beans, onions, lettuce, cucumbers, and spice plants. Ancient farmers also grew date, palm, apple, and pomegranate trees. Because crops and trees need plenty of water, Mesopotamian farmers often planted them along the canal banks. So that was interesting. They planted them close since they needed a lot of water. In the distance, on the edges of the village farmland, you might see shepherds caring for sheep and goats. So here is farmers caring for sheep and goats. Shepherds also had to ward off attacks from wild animals such as lions and jackals. Sheep were especially prized in Mesopotamia for their milk and their wool. Ancient Mesopotamia also valued cattle. Cattle were good work animals besides being used for milk, leather, and meat. So why does this all matter? The region called Mesopotamia is not naturally an inviting place to live, yet it was here that one of the world's earliest civilizations developed. Water and soil brought by the Tigris and Euphrates helped to make civilization possible. Even more important, the farmers of ancient Mesopotamia, these early farmers figured out how to use the two rivers to make the land more fertile. As in some of the early cultures, the farmers of Mesopotamia produced surplus crops. These surpluses allowed for specialization, which in turn led to the growth of towns and cities. The early cities formed a great civilization. As you will see, the legacy of the early Mesopotamian civilization reaches even into our own times. So let's look at just the links to the current event. High water. It says, do floods still destroy people's homes and properties today? Absolutely, right? Unfortunately, despite the existence of modern dams, the answer is yes. In 1997, after an unusually harsh winter, melting snow caused severe spring floods of the Red River in North Dakota. Volunteers worked together to build dikes, sometimes in the middle of the town, to stop the river from overflowing further into the neighborhoods. The federal government committed over $150 million. Find the example of a flood in modern times. Well, we've had lots of floods. Remember Hurricane Sandy we had flooding from, and I think that's an important thing to look back on. All right, our main ideas here. It's always good to read the main ideas. It's telling us what's most important. Mesopotamia is the region between the Tigris and Euphrates River. It is divided into a rugged plateau to the north and fertile plains to the south. Remember, there was more fertile land to the south. Like the Nile River, the Tigris and Euphrates flooded each year. These floods brought water and silt to Mesopotamia. Unlike those in Egypt, floods in Mesopotamia were often destructive and badly timed for farmers. Mesopotamian farmers used canal systems to control dangerous flooding, making their land productive. Yes, remember they used the canals with a system of gates to hold water in or out and emptied into artificial lakes.